So for some time, I think, like many people, including psychoanalysts, I've been a little confused about the concept of masochism. Uh, in the popular culture, masochism often seems to mean um, taking pleasure in pain or seeking pleasure through pain. Um, That is not really what Freud ever really meant by masochism. Instead of desiring pain, Freud thought of the masochist as needing punishment, not because punishment is pleasurable, but because it is felt to be deserved. That is, the person unconsciously feels guilty. And for Freud, unconscious guilt is pretty much the same thing as the need for punishment. Freud calls this moral masochism to distinguish it from sexual masochism. Uh, so today I'm primarily concerned with um, moral masochism, which could also be called psychic masochism, as distinct from sexual masochism. Um, I agree with Berliner, who has written a wonderful article back in 1955 called An Object Relations View of Masochism. I think it's the best essay on the field in the psychoanalytic literature. Complex discussion, but very eye-opening. Um, and in Berliner's view, sexual masochism is a superstructure that is built on top of psychic masochism or moral masochism or characterological masochism. Berliner is also primarily concerned with moral masochism rather than sexual masochism. Um, so Freud had conceived moral masochism essentially as the turning of aggression against the self. The child is terrified to simply vent its aggression outwards towards the frustrating or authoritarian or abusive parents, because that would simply make them angrier and would cause them to withdraw love even further. So anger is not vented outwardly, it is redirected and turned back against the self. And so now we have a person who is beating himself instead of the others who have frustrated him or deprived him. And this aggression turned on the self is taken over by the superego. That, in fact, according to Freud, is what the superego is. It is aggression redirected back against the self. So the superego is a critical, attacking, beating agency. We see this very clearly in depression. Um, and the superego is equally active in masochism. In fact, Berliner sees the distinction really between masochism and depression as rather artificial. He argues that a masochist is a person who has a depressive character and who, like the depressive, um, inflicts pain and tolerates pain, rejection, punishment because he or she feels he or she deserves punishment. So depression and masochism, very closely related phenomena. Um, Berliner traces masochism, moral masochism, psychic masochism, back to early trauma, uh, primarily pre-Oedipal oral phase. The child is seeking love and is not receiving it. Um, the primary caretaker need not be overtly sadistic, but there is usually some at least hidden sadism. The parent, if not explicitly cruel, is subtly depriving, frustrating, non-responsive. The child is seeking love. The child is finding non-love. And essentially the child becomes addicted to the quest to get blood from a stone. And the child becomes confused. Instead of getting love, he's getting rejection, he's getting um, criticism, and he comes to confuse rejection and criticism as love. Um, Quite the confusion. There's a denial on the part of the child of the hatred and the sadism and the indifference and the coldness. There is a confusion. The child denies this and comes almost to accept such rejection as love. And so now we have a person who is addicted to seeking blood from a stone. And of course, this gets transferred onto other people. And this person is perpetually getting attached to people who can't or don't love him back properly. But he submits to this. He placates the cruel, rejecting object. He beseeches it. He begs it. He submits to it. He tolerates this unjust and frustrating situation because that's how he started his life out, and this is his expectation. And he unconsciously selects people who won't or can't love him properly, and he puts up with this situation. That's masochism. He internalizes the rejecting, frustrating object into his superego, and just as he placates his love objects in the external world, so he placates his superego and submits to it because it is simply an internal echo of the external frustrating object. So now he is submitting to punishment, criticism, trying to placate his superego, unable to really stand up to it. Okay, he has internalized the rejecting object and internalized the sadism of the rejecting object. And now he has it inside him in the form of a critical and sadistic superego. So whereas for Freud, the hostile superego really begins with the drive of aggression, which gets turned on the self. For Berliner, the whole thing starts not with the drive, but with the early object relation, the early relation to a cruel and depriving or indifferent or emotionally absent object. So this is an object relations theory of narcissism as opposed to a drive theory of narcissism. It's not that Berliner rejects drive theory. Um, in the case of the obsessional neurosis, he thinks that the critical superego in that condition, where the person is having to take all kinds of precautions and magical rituals to try to placate the superego, um, Berliner is inclined to think that the formation of that superego does have to do with the aggressive drive. Such patients, he thinks, might come into the world with uh, a constitutionally based excess of sadism. And the problem is there with the drive rather than with the object. So the excessive sadism gets turned on the self, and now you have the cruel superego, and now you have a need for punishment, and now you're having to placate the superego all of the time. We see this in obsessional neurosis. Um, I wonder about Berliner's analysis here. I wonder if the sadism one finds in the superego is really coming from the drive, or whether it may, in fact, as in masochism, represent the internalization of the sadism of the early objects. Berliner is open to the idea that it comes from the drive. I wonder, even in the case of obsessional neurosis, if it really is the drive alone or also the internalized sadistic objects that are at work. I don't know, but that's the distinction. Um, okay, Berliner is really excellent in turning to the other side of the masochist's character, the masochist's own aggression. He often provokes rejection. He's angry about being frustrated and deprived and rejected. And so on the one hand, he may be questing for love and placating the object in trying to get its love. On an unconscious level, he's pretty angry. He may be provocative in subtle ways. I think Berliner refers to this as the troublemaker. The masochist is both a victim and also a troublemaker. Often it's easier to see the victim side of the picture because he was rejected and deprived and abused. But that has made him angry. Frustration leads to aggression. His aggression is deeply repressed. This is the hardest part of the analysis of a masochistic character, says Berliner. I mean, to the extent that the analyst is in tune with the patient's victimization, the patient feels understood and sympathized with. But when the analyst tries to turn his sights on the masochist's aggressive, provocative behavior, that's a more difficult analytic task, but an absolutely necessary one. The key mechanism there is Anna Freud's identification with the aggressor. The masochist is the victim of a cold and rejecting and cruel person, and he has identified with that, has taken that into his own superego, and suffers from it there. But he also identifies with this aggressor, and he plays it out towards others. and he becomes cold and rejecting and sadistic and cruel in subtle ways that are not so easy to see, but that in the analysis are essential to see. At one point in his paper, Berliner says the masochist clings to a good breast that does not exist while turning away from a good breast that might exist. So here he's drawing attention to the psychology of I would never want to belong to a club that would have me as a member. He's addicted to the stone that doesn't yield blood, but when someone warm and loving comes around, he will avoid and evade that person. Of course, in doing that, he's identified with the original rejecting object. Okay. In Freud's monumental 1917 paper, Mourning and Melancholia, Freud explains that the reason the depressive character can't mourn, and whose mourning breaks down into melancholia or depression, is because he has too much hatred towards the lost object to be able to let it go. So instead of letting it go, he introjects it into himself, and he is now attacking the object inside himself, but he has become identified with that bad object, and so in attacking the introjected object, he is attacking himself. The reproaches he brings against himself don't really fit him. They fit the object, the bad object that he has introjected. Okay. In what ways was the object bad? Probably it was felt to be rejecting, attacking, abusing, abandoning. So here again, we have the same kind of bad object experience as in the case of masochism. The masochist goes on addictively seeking the love of the bad object. The depressive introjects the bad object and attacks it inside. I mean, the masochist also introjects the bad object and seeks to placate it. The depressive is attacking it, but he's become identified with it, and so he ends up attacking himself. So these processes are closely related. In the obsessional neurosis, according to Berliner, we have a different setup. The whole thing is grounded not in traumatic experience, in object relations. It really begins in an excessively intense sadistic drive that gets turned on the self. I'm not so convinced that this is the case, because the obsessional ends up attacking himself. He ends up placating the critical superego. I mean, Berliner goes out of his way in this paper to say he's a drive theorist and has not abandoned drive theory as, say, Karen Horney and the members of her culturistic school have abandoned drive theory. He's anxious to preserve himself and be seen to be a drive theorist, and I wonder if that's part of his motive for separating out the obsessional neurosis from the object relational analysis that he applies to masochism and to depression. I think much of his argument could be extended to the obsessional as well as the depressive and the masochistic characters. he makes the point that the technique needed for the treatment of the masochistic character is not the austere, silent, remote analyst. By no means. The analyst should be friendly, um, warm, um, non-rejecting. Um, the patient should have a chance to encounter an object that is not cold, sadistic, and rejecting. But at the same time, this is not just reparative reparenting. Um, Berliner distinguishes himself from the Chicago School of Psychoanalysis and Franz Alexander's ideas of corrective emotional experience. The analyst is not playing a role, he's simply being um, a relatively friendly analyst. Um, he makes it clear that the cure comes not through the friendliness, but through the analysis, especially the analysis of the ways in which the masochist has become identified with the aggressor and is cold, cruel, abusive, indifferent to other people because he's identified with the object that was that way towards him. So a warm, friendly atmosphere in the analysis, but the um, analytic work involves, at least the second phase of the analytic work, uh, involves analyzing the degree to which the patient is not merely a victim, but also a troublemaker. He certainly makes trouble for himself and often enough makes trouble for other people as well. In a different tradition of object relations theory, that following from the work of the Scottish psychoanalyst W.R.D. Fairbairn, um, the same dynamic is seen. Uh, Early in his work, Fairbairn worked in a family clinic and he saw children who had been removed from terribly abusive homes and placed in clean and nice foster homes with friendly foster parents, and the kids are just weeping and begging to go back home where they will be abused and neglected again. This is Addiction to the Bad Object. A classic paper written by a follower of Fairbairn has the title The Allure of the Bad Object. So this is all about addiction to rejection. This is masochism, and the Fairbairnians have insight into this, and they have insight into what they call the internal saboteur, which is just another term for the sadistic critical superego. I'm thinking of a case in which Berliner's attempt to distinguish between the obsessional neurosis and masochism seems problematic. This is a person who managed to make an excellent marriage. He found a wonderful, warm woman, very unlike his cold and critical mother. And that marriage survived for many decades. How did he do this? How did he avoid the masochist's tendency to seek a bad object, like the original frustrating object? Well, this person seems to have worked out his masochism around his employment. He works it out around the company that he feels is cold and critical and attacking and rejecting, and he is continually attempting to placate it, continually attempting to prove himself to it, but never succeeded in living up to the company's demands, continually feeling like a second-class citizen, not getting the promotion. So all of his masochism seems to be, so he has split off the masochism and put it into his work life, thus preserving his marriage from that dynamic. Okay. We could think of another character who does precisely the reverse. He puts all of his masochistic inclinations into his married life, thus preserving his work life to be pursued successfully. So here he is, a great success in his professional work, but when you look into his personal life, into his marital life, he is putting up with constant criticism, rejection, coldness, and he's continually seeking blood from the stone. So people can put their masochism into different compartments of their life. So no longer can we think of moral masochism, by which Freud meant the fear of success, people who are wrecked by success, the criminal from a sense of guilt, those who clutch defeat from the jaws of victory, all of this kind of moral masochism. No longer can we conceptualize it purely in terms of the psychology of aggression turned against the self. We need to clearly investigate the early object relational origins of much of this kind of masochism. Also, the pre-Oedipal elements of masochism seem to be predominant. Masochism doesn't fundamentally have its roots in the Oedipus complex. Its roots are much earlier and harder to grasp because they are located in that dim, shadowy, pre-verbal, pre-Oedipal realm. Okay.